Our approach to ethics. This is the first weekly video for the semester in terms of course content, the information one will need to become familiar with and work with throughout the week. This is the information that one needs to participate in the weekly discussion, as well as, just given that this is the first week, this will be information about the way we are to approach ethics as a topic, as well as information about how our approach will influence what we're doing every single week throughout the semester. Typically, these weekly videos, you may not get the entire script of the video like you'll have on hand this week. Some weeks there may be less information inside the sort of handout you receive for these weekly videos, and I'll just expand upon these various bullet points. But this week, given that it is the first week, I think that it's important and helpful for everyone to have sort of the whole script in their hand for this particular video. But to get started, there are many ways that any class could approach the topic of ethics. You will encounter discussions of ethics throughout many of your other classes, especially if you're in a healthcare or human services or engineering or technological profession. The topic of ethics always comes up. It's unavoidable, and that's one of the reasons for a course like this one, where we get to step back away from these particular professions where ethics arises in and look at ethics in a more general way, so that we are better prepared when those discussions actually do come up in our professions. But there are many ways to approach it. The way we will approach it is, this is a philosophy-based class, which means we're going to approach ethics from the angle of philosophical inquiry and argumentation, which that very likely means very little to people in the class at this point, but it will mean a whole lot more by the end of this video, as well as when we're making our way through the semester. To begin, inside the larger discipline of philosophy, this is the sort of root of the core of the tree is philosophy. There is a branch of philosophy, namely this one, commonly referred to as axiology. And inside that branch is ethics. Well, a person immediately could ask, well, what is philosophy? And what is axiology? What is ethics? Well, axiology and ethics we'll definitely have a handle on by the end of this video, but just to give a person a sense that philosophy as a discipline is huge. It is as big as any other academic discipline like biology or mathematics. So just to do an analogy here, if this beginning node was mathematics, then the branches might be something like arithmetic, geometry, trigonometry, calculus, and then applied calculus and applied trigonometry, on and on and on to physics math, to math that's specifically designed with a focus in electrical engineering, etc. So that gives you a sense that mathematics is a gigantic discipline. The biology, physiology fields are huge. Well, philosophy is no different, and there are many branches within philosophy. These are just the major ones that a lot of people in philosophy would be immediately familiar with. They would immediately look at this and say, yeah, that seems like a reasonable way to parse the field of philosophy. In that in philosophy, there's people who study metaphysical issues, problems, argumentation, epistemological. And just to give everyone a sense, questions in metaphysics are questions about what is the nature of something, like what is the nature of reality, what are objects, what are properties, what are traits, characteristics, a lot of fundamental questions that other disciplines do address. For example, something like physics. In physical sciences, a lot of their questions show up in what philosophy would consider to be metaphysics. And then there's epistemology. This branch, it just deals with questions about knowledge, justification, truth, evidence, data. Like epistemology people deal with the notion of expertise. Like, what does it actually mean to be an expert on something? What does it mean to know something? And people familiar with psychology or the cognitive sciences would immediately key up and think, oh, some of those questions sound familiar to what I've encountered in my psych classes or my cog-sci classes. And that's to be expected. Epistemology questions do scope over the cognitive sciences, psychological sciences. They just ask questions that those disciplines may not spend a whole lot of time addressing. They assume answers to certain questions, and then the discipline of the scientific discipline moves forward. Whereas in epistemology, philosophy people will hover over these questions and try to develop answers and argumentation about them. Then there's logic and computation. This branch of philosophy deals with everything from artificial intelligence, AI software, to reasoning, the better and worse ways to reason and think our way through complicated problems, which we will be encountering areas of this branch in terms of argumentation during week 2's video and what we're doing throughout the semester. And then there's axiology, which we will get to. There's also a branch in philosophy that focuses on the historical figures within philosophy, what their historical context was. For example, in philosophy, that people may have heard of Socrates or Plato or Aristotle, Descartes, David Hume. In the history of philosophy, people focus on the context of those particular individuals, how their context may have influenced how they thought about things or how they argued about things, the theories they proposed. Then there are special topics. In philosophy, there is a philosophy of everything. There's a philosophy of science, philosophy of physics, philosophy of sports, where philosophy people focus in on certain fundamental questions about a particular topic. Like, for example, philosophy of science would focus on this, like the nature of the scientific method, the actual process. Like, how do scientists do what they do? What is their method, their mode of operation? Are there values showing up in science that influence the outcomes of research projects, etc.? That's just one example. There's a philosophy of love, a philosophy of culture. There's philosophy of anything imaginable, popular culture. Then there is metaphilosophy, which this is like quality control. It comes in, and this is the philosophy people who look over the top of all these other branches and ask questions like, has any progress actually been made? Are we working ourselves into various, alleys and cul-de-sacs that we can't get out of? These are quality control people. They're like, have we produced anything of quality recently? And what would it mean for it to be quality rather than, well, garbage? And that's just a quick and rough and ready overview of what some of these branches are. Me personally, my specializations, like my domains of philosophy that I have the most knowledge about are these three. In terms of when I was in graduate school, my focus was in philosophy of mind, the cognitive sciences, robotics, artificial intelligence, software. And as happens, that sort of pushed me over into electrical engineering. So my areas of focus and concentration have typically been inside these more mechanical, technical aspects of philosophy, asking questions like, what is the nature of intelligence? What would it mean to write a piece of software that was actually intelligent, that has a capability of learning, of growing, developing in some lifelike manner? like bio-inspired robotics, where we look at nature and then try to build machines that mimic these natural features of various animals in an effort to, in a sense, reinvent the intelligence wheel or to understand more about intelligence. It's like creating simulations and models of seemingly intelligent things in an effort to understand more about human and animal intelligence, how it is that we do what we do, how our minds work, how we think, how we reason. So that has been my overall focus throughout philosophy. But as any philosophy person does, throughout school we are trained to be able to teach pretty much anything within any of the branches. Even though that may not be our specialization, we all have to do, typically teach ethics classes, and it's fun. Ethics is a lot of fun. It's an interesting topic when it's approached from a philosophical angle. At least to me, it is. And I have worked with this particular class or versions of it at numerous schools throughout at least 15, 16 years at this point. So even though ethics is not my particular focus, that's a good thing for people in this class, because that our approach to ethics may not be the same as you would experience in, say, a different kind of ethics class with a different kind of teacher. That a professional ethicist, someone who specializes in ethics, could very well try to teach a class like this one focused on trying to make people, make them more or less moral, make them better people. That is not my focus. The way that we will approach ethics, and the way I've always approached it, is an excellent opportunity to learn about how ethics plays out in our various professions and daily lives, as well as argumentation, which is the key to all of philosophy, which we will see more of today as well as next week. We'll see it this week as well as next week, as well as all the rest of the weeks in this class. With philosophy, argumentation, it reigns supreme. And so we approach ethics more as a domain that a particular sort of inquiry and argumentation occurs. And we'll talk more about that in this video. We'll have a lot more to say about it. But my purpose will never be to judge someone and what they say as to whether or not they're a more or less moral person or an ethical person. That's not my job. That's above my pay grade. Instead, what we're trying to do is gain a sense of what ethics and ethical decision making and how this kind of plays out in our real lives and in our jobs, and try to gain a handle on that so that we're more prepared. We understand what it's about so that we can interact with it more effectively, more productively. And that's quite a few words, but hopefully that provides everyone with a context. They're kind of like philosophy. If a person had to define it, there's a lot of ways to define it, but my preferred way, the working or operational definition I use, is that philosophy is a systematic and an unapologetic form of inquiry that addresses questions that show up in all of these branches by means of a sort of argumentative prose, like questions are asked, reasons are offered, and we analyze those arguments, we collect them together, we collect the objections, and then we move forward. And it's into all of these topics. Typically, people specialize. They go down these branches. Like I've expanded axiology with this twofold thing, but it could be expanded 50 or 100-fold down. The same with all these other branches, just like any science, any mathematics, any literature. And so, just to repeat that, in case people would like to have a sort of working definition, is that philosophy tends to be systematic and unapologetic inquiry into questions that show up in topics like these by means of argumentation. And you could contrast that with the definition of, say, biology. Biology, we typically say, oh, it's the study of life, but it's so much more than that. It's more like biology is a systematic and unapologetic inquiry into topics that are associated with this phenomenon we call life, like the cell and mitochondria, all these things that the pieces, the parts, the wholes that make up life. But the biologic method or mode of operation tends to be experimentation, data collecting. It uses a scientific based method, whereas in philosophy it's a more argumentation based method. And that'll mean a lot more to people as we go through this video and as we progress throughout the semester. But philosophy is the parent, these are its children, and these children have children. Axiology, one of its children is ethics. If that helps you think about this category system, by all means use that analogy. Well, axiology, just in general, there's a lot of ways people could define it. But typically, it's a philosophical study of values and valuation, how we evaluate things, how we place value or perceive things as being valuable. And within it is aesthetics, which in aesthetics, if we think about that, aesthetics has to do with beauty and art and symmetry and crafts and anything that people like make that has an attractive quality to it. So there's value there. Attraction is a value. It's something that we value. We would rather have, say, a pretty house than the ugliest house on the block in a neighborhood. And aesthetics and philosophy, approaching it philosophically, looks at the various cases that could be made for something counting as more or less artistic or beautiful, etc. Well, ethics also deals with values and valuation when you approach it from a philosophical way, and especially the way we are approaching it. Not every ethics class you take would approach it this way, but this is what we're going to do. Given that axiology is one of the parents and ethics is a child, then if the philosophical study of values and valuation is what axiology is, then it's going to follow that approaching ethics, we will do so from the point of view of values and valuation. And it's like, it follows. If its parent is values and valuation, then ethics, the child, is going to be about values and valuations too. And we'll make more sense of that as we move forward. That the core assumption we're making in this class is that any ethical issue, scenario, inquiry, the theories we look at, the arguments we look at, they're always involving values. It's inescapable. That is our assumption, that there's always going to be something at stake that matters to people, that people actually care about. And that's what these particular debates, arguments, discussions focus on. Now, there are particular human discussions that may have little or nothing to do with values, but most of them do in some kind of way. Humans are valuing creatures. We tend to assign things and say, that's worthwhile, that's worthless. We tend to make these sort of value judgments all the time. And ethics, as we'll see, does that too. It's just a little more focused. And so the idea is that when you approach ethics from the point of view of values and valuation, you're looking at the values that are being assumed, that are being shared by people, interpreted, prioritized, defended, disparaged throughout the course of our daily lives in any encounter that might be referred to as ethical. But to say a little more about that, what are values? Well, values is a big topic, and there's tons of books written on it by philosophical and non-philosophical people, but the essence of values is that something can be valuable. Most anything could be, depending on the person or the context. But they tend to be traits or behaviors or attitudes, properties, or things that people tend to perceive as good, desirable, virtuous, or worthwhile. When we say that has value, what we mean is it's worthwhile. It has some worth. And it matters. It matters that it exists. It matters that it's in place, that we want it to be there in some kind of way. It's desirable. It's something, if we were to have it, our lives would be more valuable. And whereas there's also this notion of disvalues, those are the same thing except the negation of them. They're the traits, the behaviors, the properties, the things that we typically perceive as bad or undesirable. They're vice-like. They lack worth. They're the things we want to get rid of, that we would rather our lives not contain. They could also be, given that we're talking about ethics, typically when you talk about a disvalue in ethics, it's typically because it's harmful or it's dangerous. It threatens safety, human safety, or it could be animal safety in some kind of particular way. And the idea is to try to mitigate these disvalues, to try to minimize them, and to reduce the chance of people getting hurt or animals getting hurt. And avoiding hurt is a key aspect of ethics that may not be the same in other sorts of domains that deal with values. Like, we'll look at some examples. But just to gain a sense of how big the notion of values actually is, in this week's module, I've included just a preliminary list. This is the preliminary list of values and disvalues. This list is nowhere near exhaustive, and we'll see that in just a second. But the idea behind giving everybody this list is to just gain a sense of things that people might consider to be valuable or of disvalue, things that people might consider worth promoting and protecting, and things that people might consider better off never to have been. That we try to minimize these traits or behaviors or things in the world. And some ideas is like a value might be bravery. Like if we're talking about a military, like soldiers or law enforcement, we may say that that's a brave soldier. And we mean that as a term, it's like a phrase of endearment. It's a praise. It's in Latin, it would be a laude. We praise someone for being brave. We value their bravery. Their bravery is a value to us. We would much rather have soldiers that run forward to meet the enemy or think and strategize and plan in a way to be effective with the enemy. But we typically would consider it to be a disvalue if a soldier runs at the first gunshot, that they run away and hide under the truck. Typically, I'm not saying in all cases, this is by no means a universal claim about bravery and how it actually operates in human value systems, but it's just typical observation that bravery tends to be a good thing if you're a soldier, law enforcement, whatever, or a parent defending your child. It's like bravery shows up at times when it's most needed, or either it doesn't. So bravery, also a value in some cases, is like that something is built. Like a house, if we want to build a house, once the house has this property of being built, it's done, it's completed, well, that's more valuable than when it was unfinished. We couldn't live in it when it didn't have a roof on it. Now that it's built with a roof, walls, windows, doors, we can live in it. It's become habitable. So the fact that something is built, just the fact that it's fully done, can be valuable. Also, some things like control. A lot of times people talk about they want to take control of their lives, or we control various industrial processes with software. And that's valuable. It's better to be in control of a huge assembly line that's half a mile long than for that assembly line to be out of control and throwing the parts and the products all in the floor. So we will tend to value a controlled, managed, predictable assembly line versus businesses definitely value that, versus one that just throws the buckets and the parts everywhere when it, whenever it wants to, however it wants to, whatever it wants, whenever it wants. That's out of control. It's not bounded in a particular sort of way. And some of these things, sometimes these values overlap. Like bravery may involve this notion of courage. Like, is being brave the exact same thing as being courageous? That's something to think about. People that have conviction, sometimes we consider that to be a value, but it can also become a disvalue if taken to extremes, like the notion of fanaticism, where someone or some group gets so convicted that they can't listen to anyone else, and they go forward with however they perceive is the best way to go, while at the same time ignoring all the other possibilities of others. People could get hurt if someone is too convicted. Think of like typical stereotypical movie, like the baddies in movies. They tend to be hyper convicted about something where a bunch of people end up getting hurt. We tend not to admire that kind of conviction. We tend not to praise it. We tend to want to shame and blame that type of conviction. So conviction could go either way. That's the reason this is a list with that sort of bar of values, disvalues. It depends on the context whether it would be classified as a value or a disvalue. And we always have to provide a context. Whenever we say something is a value or a disvalue, we need some sort of context and reasoning to buy in that, yeah, that actually would be. Things like dull or dullness, like a particular tool that's intended to be sharp, like a drill bit, and when it goes dull, well, then that's a disvalue. That drill bit won't drill the holes we want it to drill, so we throw it in the trash, or we try to sharpen it, or we, buy better drill bits. So dullness can be a disvalue. But in some cases, if I'm trying to like peel stickers off of, side of a, like political ad stickers or bumper sticker on a car, having something that's dull might be a better way to go than having something really sharp that's going to cut the paint off of it. Having a dull implement that's just sharp enough to get under the edge of the sticker could be good. It could be a value. I'd rather have this dull tool than this sharp tool for this application. So any of these things, anything on this list could be a value or a disvalue. But one always has to provide a context to help people understand how it could be. There's plenty on here. Certainly, we're not going to talk through all of these, and I've just started this alphabetical list. It's just to give people a sense of what we have in mind when we're talking about values, the things that people find worthwhile, or disvalues, the things that people tend to disparage, they don't like, they kind of do their best to get rid of. And this sort of like values are the sort of must-haves. They're awesome. Whereas disvalues are the sort of can't stands. And sure, there would be things that are value neutral, things that, in certain contexts doesn't really matter one way or another. But in this course, we're kind of just values, disvalues. It keeps things a little more simple, a little more straightforward. Another thing like values could be parents. Some of us highly value our parents, their knowledge, their efforts to raise us and feed us and clothe us and tend to us the rest of our lives. Whereas for other people, they may have had totally different life encounters with parents, and parents are viewed with deep suspicion. Once again, that's just another example of values, disvalues. Context is extremely important. And given that there is so much divergence about how these may be interpreted by specific individuals or groups, that means that we don't always agree about values. It's a given in life. But while we're at this list, it's a perfect time to mention that in this course there's multiple extra credit opportunities. And one of your very first extra credit opportunities is to think about this. Look through this list, and it's in an ABC order, so it makes it a little easier. Just look through the list. Take a few minutes, look through it, think about context in which these sorts of values or disvalues could arise. And then if you can think of 3 value, disvalue, whichever way you want to go, that are not on this list. By no means, it's not exhaustive. If you can think up 3 values or disvalues that are not on this list, you can post those to one of the extra credit forums, which, I've already shown everyone where that is in the initial, welcome to the class video, the introductory video. But you can go to that first extra credit, post 3 that are not on this list, and provide reasons or a context, enough information to help people see that, yes, that would actually be a value, or yes, that would actually be a disvalue. But we need your reasoning. If you can come up with 3 that are not on this list, which there's thousands that are not on this list, you post them to that forum, you provide your reasons for thinking they're a value or a disvalue, and you're done. And you'll gain extra credit for having done so. The only restrictions is that the value or disvalue cannot appear on this list, and moreover, they cannot be the same as what somebody else has already posted. So you'll need to look through what other people have posted before you go posting the 3 you came up with. If somebody else happens to jump out there and get 1 or 2 or all 3 of what you were thinking about before you do, well, you just have to come up with 3 more. But there are thousands to pick from. So in this list, there may be, I don't know, there could very well be a couple hundred on this list. There's thousands more. So it's just an easy way to get some extra credit right out of the gate for this kind of class. And moreover, it's a helpful exercise to get people to thinking about this. Because ethics, as far as the way we're approaching it, it's all about values. Thinking about values a whole lot this week and the weeks to come, it's only going to help you understand it more. So that is the list of values, disvalues. That list appears in this week's module, as well as you have an opportunity for extra credit. Just keep in mind the extra credit opportunity. It does expire. You have about 3 weeks from now to do it. And if you want it, go ahead and do it. It's, in a sense, it's much easier to do it this week, next week, and be done with it than it would be to try to come back at the end. So it locks down after about 3 weeks from today. Now, to move forward, well, how do these values and disvalues specifically relate to ethics? We've seen them: bravery, courage, compassion, diligence. All of those would be values. Well, how do those things relate, though, to particular ethical, moral debates? Notice that when I put this hyphen here, ethical, people sometimes refer to ethics as something different from morality, or ethical is different from being moral. And there is some justification in doing that. But for our purposes, we're just treating these two as though they're synonyms, they're synonymous. Anytime I say ethical, you could just as well put moral there. If I say immoral, you could just as easily put unethical there. And we're not going to get caught up in like that hard and fast distinction between the two. For those who are interested in the distinction, typically people will talk about morality and mean like some larger thing that scopes over the whole planet and all humans. Whereas sometimes they will say that ethics is more culture or organization specific, like the code of ethics for nurses. And they want to make a sort of bigger, smaller distinction between these two. Like morality is much, much bigger in scope than ethics is much, much more narrower in scope. But for our purposes, given that this is an introductory first, encounter class, you can use ethics, you can use morals, you can use ethical, moral, immoral, unethical, all synonymously. There's, and I will certainly be doing that throughout the semester. So even though there is reason to think that we could distinguish between these two words and concepts, for our purposes, we're not really going to do so. But how does ethics relate to values, disvalues? Well, ethics tends to appear anytime we have a question about or a decision. So when we're trying to decide what would be the most ethical way to do something, what should we do? What ought we to do? What are we obligated to do? Those are hallmark ethical style questions. When we're making decisions, like what ought we to do? What should we do? In a given situation. And it can be more case specific, like, is it okay to help a grandparent that's sick, they're suffering with bone cancer? Would it be okay to assist in their euthanasia, like their death, chemically induced or whatever? It's like, would that be a good or a bad thing to do? Would we have done something wrong if we were to do that? Then also ethical questions can go after we've done something. When we look back in retrospect, we're like, did I do the right thing? That's a typical hallmark style ethical question. And people in general, they will agree and disagree about the values involved. Like, depending on how those questions are answered, people may or may not buy into your answer because they may or may not buy into what you find is valuable or disvaluable. Like what an organization, like what is ethical for one culture may be perceived as unethical by another culture. And that could be just because they disagree about which values to prioritize, which we will see this many times throughout the semester. And we will discuss more about how that might play out on whole culture levels, during one of the upcoming weeks. But typically, ethical debates, they appear when there's these kind of questions. What should we do? Did we do the right thing? What ought we to do? What are we obligated to do? Did we do what we were obligated to do? Etc. And people will disagree about the values or disvalues, which ones to give priority to in the particular situation. And there's an example here. Like when confronted with a question about abortion. A question about abortion could be something like, is it morally okay to abort? We're familiar with this. It shows up in the news. It's in dispute at this very moment. And it will always recurrently come up and be in dispute. Ethical issues recur because humans tend to encounter these same questions over and over again in their lives. The questions don't go away until sometimes we resolve it. Temporarily we say, okay, this is the right thing to do, this is the wrong thing to do, and we don't really question it anymore. But typically, these questions kind of rise back to the surface. It's like our sort of quality control. We do self-checks on ourselves. And so when we're confronted with a question about abortion, one person might tout, and tout just means they might try to sell you on. They may try to persuade you. That one person may try to sell you on the idea that the value of the life of the fetus is so much more important than this value of personal choice. Whereas somebody else might place a super uber high value on the ability of people to choose what happens within and to their body when they want it to or not, over the value that's many attach to the life of the fetus or a newborn. And so you see immediately there's just an opportunity for a very deep divergence and disagreement between how those two people see the world. That if personal choice is one's uber value, well, that person's not going to be easily persuaded about the value of something else. If they have set it up like if it was on a point scale and they assign like a 99 to the value of being able to choose what we want to do with our own bodies, at a 99, that means that everything else, there's 98 other slots, that fetal life is probably going to be something far, far lower down on the scale. But it could go the other way, that some people might put fetal life or life in general up there at 100. And then everything else has to have some value score less than 100. And so how do we resolve these sort of conflicts of values? We will discuss that. Or how do we at least make sense of what's going on? Most of the time, that's a big enough challenge in itself. We have to understand before we solve. We'll see that as we go forward. Either way, as soon as values enter a discussion that involves human decisions, our behavior, our conduct, what we should do, what we shouldn't do, and especially if there's a chance for someone to be harmed, given the outcome based on what we do or decide, that discussion or debate or argument, it's immediately got an ethical quality. That's the sort of threefold way to think about what is an ethics anything? Well, it is going to have some values involved, and typically it's going to be associated with human behavior, attitudes, conduct, like what we should or shouldn't be doing. And then the third thing is what we should or shouldn't be doing has the potential to harm somebody. It could be dangerous. It could, impinge upon safety, bodily, psychological, financial, whatever sort of safety you want to think about. If it has those three elements, there's a whole bunch of values that people assign different priorities to. It's revolving around decisions about what people should or shouldn't do, their conduct, their behavior, their attitudes, and somebody could be harmed depending on how we decide or what we choose to do. You've got ethics. That you have an ethical scenario. That, if you want to say, what is ethics? Well, it's the study of those three things when they all arrive at one location at one time. So I'll say that again so everybody has a sense of what is ethics, a sort of operational working definition that'll always serve you well, is that ethics is about, or it involves, human decisions about behavior and conduct, human behavior and conduct, where somebody could be harmed, or some sort of harm could occur to people involved in it, that involve conflicts or disagreements or different prioritizations of values. That's what ethics is. And you can read this sentence. You'll have this, to look at and kind of ponder over. But those three things tend to always show up when ethics is in play. Doesn't matter if it's a professional, business ethics, the code of ethics for nursing, the code of ethics for engineers, or if it is just us on the street, talking about something. People are going to tend to recognize something as ethical or moral when it involves those three elements. And for our purposes, whenever we talk about, an ethical agreement, what we mean is that there's been an agreement about values. That at the most fundamental level, when people agree, like say two people say that abortion is not always bad, they are going to agree on certain values. Like maybe they both agree and prioritize like personal choice, around the similar scale, number. If they assigned a number to it, they would assign pretty much the same number to personal choice, how important that is to protect. Whereas if we're talking about ethical conflict, it's going to be a value conflict. There could be many, many, many other things going on, but at base, when people disagree about what we should or shouldn't be doing, or they disagree about whether somebody did something right or wrong, it's almost always going to involve a difference of values. Like, here's a sort of scenario, is say that Bob goes into a store and steals, some food and takes it back. And his reasons for stealing it was that he has a hungry child at home. That Bob has, at the moment he's unemployed or he doesn't have ready access to funds. His child is really, hungry. And Bob, feels an obligation to protect the life and well being of this child, and he needs an immediate resolution. So he steals food from the store. Now, two people, after presenting that scenario, there's many people in this class. I am certain that there are people in this class that have just heard this scenario. Some of them will say, well, Bob's action was okay. He stole, yes, but he did it for a good reason. Whereas there will be other people that will say that Bob's action was wrong, regardless of the fact that he wants to feed the child. He could find other ways. Like instead of spending the time stealing, he could have been out going for job interviews. That there's many jobs that a person could do in this world. They may not want to do all of them, but if they need basic amounts of money to buy food, they can find them. So it's wrong to steal regardless of Bob's reasons. That shows a difference in how these two people set value priorities in the world. Like they value honesty or they disvalue theft so severely and they value this notion of diligence and hard work, or there's always other options. They set high values on those sorts of things, whereas the other person may just see the life of the kid and be able to write off, the disvalue of theft is not severe enough to override the goodness or the valuable quality of, feeding a child that needs food. And so you see, that's why an ethical conflict will typically be a value conflict. And what we'll do throughout this class, we're going to have a method to help us home in on what values are really at stake. And the reason we want to do that is because that's what's most fundamental. If we can identify the disagreement of value, and if we can identify the agreements of value, we may actually be able to reach resolution. But if we don't even notice that those things are in play and we don't know what values are underlying our claims or our thoughts, it's extremely difficult to ever reach an agreement or to ever resolve a disagreement. And I spell that out more here about X and Y. Just put whatever name you want, Bob and Ted or Sally and Susie, whatever. You can read through this. But hopefully the Bob example and how the Bob with thievery gave everyone a sense of how these things typically play out. But it is important to notice that all ethical conflicts, they're absolutely value conflicts at the most fundamental level. There's many other factors, but value conflict tends to be always there. Although ethical conflicts, they are always conflicts of value. Value conflicts in and of themselves don't always have to be ethical conflicts. I give an example here about the relative nutritional merit or value of apples over oranges, and everyone can read through this. But you can also just think simply, like every day. Like we've all heard some people that'll talk about that two people could disagree over whether Toyota trucks are mechanically superior or inferior to Ford trucks. Or one person might talk about that Android phones are better than iPhones. Or it could be that however it goes with phones and operating systems. The idea is we can disagree about these things and see and value like the features of an iPhone over those of an Android. It's like and people can disagree about that, but it's not really about human harm or safety. So it doesn't have a distinctively ethical quality. It's just a conflict of values or a disagreement about values, and we tend to be able to resolve these things a lot of times. Both people may walk away and they still like whatever phone they picked, but they might be able to give some ground and say, well, I can see why that person thinks that an Android is a good thing. I understand it. I'm still going to keep my iPhone, but I understand where they're coming from. And so, but there's nothing about human safety. There's nothing about what we ought or ought not to do in such conflicts. It's more like we're just discussing our values. And we may or may not agree with each other about all those values, but there's no real distinctive ethical quality to it. And typically, questions of just like brute force science or mathematics or, a lot of technical questions, it's not really a matter of values. Like an example would be from what an area I'm more familiar with is like electrical engineering. And it's not like some people may say that one formula is they prefer to use one math formula to like calculate impedance when it involves like alternating current. And another person may say, well, I prefer this other formula to calculate impedance. And or this technique for doing it. We could talk about that. I can ask, well, why do you prefer that formula? They could ask the same question to me, and we can list out our reasons. And in those reasons we will be promoting our the things we find most valuable about those formulas. It could be the things we find of most disvalue about the other formula that the other person tends to prefer. But that's not really an ethical value conflict. That's just an everyday value conflict. That's like a student or a practicing electrical engineer, disagreement, or we're trying to understand. Keep in mind that we may start out disagreeing. We think we disagree. But the more we talk and offer reasons and actually discuss what's fundamentally at stake as far as what we find of most value or disvalue, many times we can realize that we're not really disagreeing. We think we thought we were, but we're really not. That we could agree on both things. It could just come down to a matter of preference. It could just be habit. It may not be a fundamental, big, momentous value disagreement. It's just something to think about. And so, well, now what is it with like value conflicts that set them apart from these things about Toyota trucks or phones or formulas in electrical engineering? Well, typically, how they are resolved. Certain value conflicts are resolved simply by appealing to the outcome of various scientific experiments or appealing to the speed at which a calculation could be made. These things, they have nothing really to do with sociocultural norms, what's often referred to as norms. They have nothing to do really, like we can, in a sense, objectively measure. Like if someone says, I prefer using this formula over this one or this other one, and then someone says, well, why? And say, well, I can do this calculation so much quicker. It's got fewer steps. It's more efficient in terms of my time. I put less time in to get the same thing out that you put a whole lot more time using this other formula to get out the same results. So efficiency, speed of performance. And the idea is we can actually physically create standards. We can use stopwatches. We can take out tape measures. We can measure and see the results of those measurements. And those are our standards. Those are how certain disagreements and value conflicts are resolved. It's just a matter of doing the measurements. Someone says that house is taller than that other house, and I like tall houses, so I like that one. And then we say, but then the other person says, but they're really the same size. So I prefer neither. I like tall houses too, but they're the same size. Well, we can resolve that disagreement. We can get a tape measure out and measure it, and then those two people will be like, whoa, okay. Then the disagreement evaporates. They go on about their business. But in ethical value conflicts, we don't really have tape measures. Or we do, but they're metaphorical tape measures. We have to use something different. These ethical value conflicts typically cannot be resolved by whipping out a tape measure or a microscope or whatever sensor measurement device you can imagine. They have to be resolved some other kind of way, and typically that's through appealing to various norms like sociocultural, communal, organizational. All three of these sorts of norms show up as these ethical litmus tests, like litmus tests, acidity, alkalinity, sort of thing, in science. So, in a sense, you can just say as the measurement tool, the standard of measurement. How do we decide? Litmus test is just a sort of standard metaphor for some sort of metric. Well, the metric that's used to make sense of and hopefully resolve ethical conflicts tends to be appeals to norms. And the thing about that is all that norms are values that typically show up in statement format, that's like a whole phrase or a sentence, rather than that list of values, disvalues. You see, that was just single words, concepts. Whereas a standard or a norm tends to be spelled out, and we'll see an example of that, in the next page or so. But the idea is these standards or norms, those are what we use. And an example would be the one that I put here is like, suppose that you have your child, you go to the grocery store, you come home, and then all of a sudden you notice your child has this package of cookies or Cheetos or Fritos or whatever, it's in their hand. And you look and think about a parent's knee-jerk reaction, just typical parent, we're talking about like averages here. We're, like the mean. We're not talking about, the variation, but just a sort of typical scenario as a parent will be, look at the kid, look at that bag of cookies or chips and say, what did you do? We're like, where did you get those cookies from? And then the kid's like, it could be, if it's anything like, the kids I've been familiar with, they may be a smart kid, and there's a question mark about smartness in this notion. And they say, what? Nobody saw me. There were lots of cookies on the shelf. There were lots of Fritos. No one's going to miss it. And then what is the typical parent going to say? It doesn't matter that there were lots of cookies there. It doesn't matter that no one saw you take those cookies. It doesn't matter. Stealing is wrong. You did badly. Well, what is that parent appealing to? That notion of stealing is wrong. That's a norm. That's all it is. It is a collection of communal, social, individual values that have been, kind of condensed, or in some sense, and it's always a condensing, that it's been condensed into like a 3-word sentence. Stealing is wrong. Well, what kind of values are under this that go in to make up this norm? Well, things like honesty, not being deceptive, that the value of personal property, that if something belongs to the store, it doesn't belong to me. And I don't want my property stolen, so I don't steal their property. And when I steal from them, it financially hurts them. See, there's a harm involved. Always a harm when it comes to ethics and morality. And so we could keep thinking about that. You can take that notion, stealing is wrong, and then go look at that list of values, disvalues, and see how many actually do underlie that norm. And, that sort of sociocultural norm in, typically in this culture, in United States culture, tends to be that it's better to avoid stealing. We're in a culture that values property and ownership and capital, that financial things that we have to spend money on or somebody spent money on. That money is time and resources that they invested, and then they have this product that they're out there trying to sell in order to make more money. And so stealing is kind of really, really bad in United States culture. If you get caught, at least. because if we have a lot of values tied up in property and ownership. I mean, a lot of our typical cultural values involve that. It's just part of being what some people would say is a capitalistic society. Property tends to have it tends to be really high on the value prioritization scale. And putting your hands and scooping up somebody else's stuff is typically not perceived as a good thing. Now, we're not here assessing whether this norm of stealing is wrong. We're not assessing whether that's just true ultimately for everybody on the planet. That's not what we're doing. We will discuss people who try to do that sort of stuff in a few weeks from now. Then discussions of relativism and absolutism and all these other isms. But at the moment, we just need to notice that stealing is wrong. There is a lot. There are many, many, many values and disvalue judgments underneath that phrase. But that is a norm. That's a typical norm. And what happens with these value conflicts and their resolutions is that what did we do as the parent? The kid scooped up some cookies, didn't pay for them. We tell them, oh, you did wrong. And in order to motivate the wrongness of that, to help modify the kid's way of perceiving the world and their behavior to try to create future modification of behavior, we appeal to this simple little catchphrase: stealing's wrong. You don't do it. And I mean, we typically don't go into a big elaborate discussion about the values. Sometimes we do make efforts along those lines. Like, how would you feel if you'd bought those cookies and somebody just took them and you come back and your cookies are gone? You see, we do that with our children. We do it with other adults, with our peers on the job. We do it. And not just about stealing. We do it about a whole lot of things, like showing up late repeatedly at work. Eventually somebody's going to say, hey, this isn't good. And then if you say, well, why? Why does it matter? They're going to start listing out various values that underlie that norm of be on time. That's a norm. Be on time. Your employer, and they may try to tell you, may discuss this notion. And they may be right about it. But the employer is investing in you, that in order for the business to run smoothly, which you notice the business running smoothly. Smooth running is a value. Efficient operation. And they can say, yeah, whenever you show up late, it holds up all these other people, and that costs time, that costs money, that slows the whole process down. We got customers or people out here waiting for our services. We can't get those services to them because you keep showing up late. And you see, that whole discussion of all the values that discussion contains is underlying this sort of simple little norm, everyday norm of you should show up to work on time. So that's how it works. Hopefully these examples, that's the reason, I wanted to talk through this written text for this week so everybody gets a sense of what these words mean and how the stuff plays out. But that's typically what happens. And there's other things, like besides norms that show up when we're trying to resolve value conflicts or change behavior, we're going to encounter like these internal rational imperatives. This falls under a theoretical framework often called deontology. We will encounter it in a few weeks. Intuitions also fall under deontology. And then there's also sometimes we appeal to long and short-range consequences for a majority of people. That's what I did in this thing I was just talking about with people showing up late to work. The consequences of that are the short range is that everybody was waiting around for it. Couldn't get started. The long range are the customers or the people, the service receivers are not getting their product, they're not getting their service in a timely manner, and they may walk out and not come back. And then the business loses enough customers, it's no longer a business. Now you don't have a job because you couldn't show up on time. You see, that is the long and short range consequences, which isn't really about, they're used to explain why showing up late is bad or why you should show up on time. Like, so these sorts of notions a lot of times give more reasons to make sense of the norms. And, if that seems a little, complex to make sense of, well, the reality is it is complex. But we're going to try to find a way to get through this complexity in an efficient manner. By the end of this video, hopefully everyone will see that this is complicated, but we have ways of working through complexity. And sociocultural norms, I've already described this and give examples. Here's some more examples. Stealing is wrong. Torturing kittens for fun is wrong. It's like you may have never encountered this norm, but you can immediately recognize it as something that in our country, most people are going to they're going to tend to say, yeah, you torture kitties, that's probably bad. I mean, we're not passing judgment on whether these things are accurate or true. All we're doing is recognizing that they exist and that people use them all the time in jobs, everyday life. And then here's the old standard, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's not only a norm, that is a prescription for how to behave. Notice that all these things are about behavior, conduct. They also all avoid harm. They also all include the notion of harm. Stealing is wrong. The idea of someone can say, why? Well, because it can hurt the person who owns the stuff. You've taken their time, their money. That's hurtful. Or torturing kittens is wrong, for fun is wrong. Well, why? Well, you're hurting the kittens. And you may be hurting yourself. You may be becoming, your character may be slowly eroding away and becoming worse and worse because you tortured kittens for fun at that. And then also the do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. The idea is you don't hit somebody in the eye when you know you don't want them to hit you in the eye. You see, harm is always involved in moral norms and ethical norms. So, and it's good to recognize this up front, to know it. It helps make ethics so everyday. It's not mystical, it's not, magical. We're familiar with all these things, but we may not have ever thought about them in a systematic way. And thus, when we're talking about norms, we're still talking about values. Norms just happen to be sentences or prescriptive or imperative things that include that they're depending on people accepting a whole bunch of values and sharing those values. They only work if everybody's buying into a lot of the values that they're kind of condensing into one sentence. Like stealing is wrong only works on people that think of personal property as something valuable that other people want to hold on to just as much as they want to hold on to. If they don't see it that way, then this norm may or may not have any appeal to them. It may have little to no sway over them. And then, that's what norms are designed to do. They're designed to guide, influence the ways we interact with one another, or that we behave toward each other, typically to keep us from hurting each other unnecessarily or intentionally. That's what they're for. And an example would be that this is really interesting, that, I'm just gesturing, like in general, at norms and values, and giving everybody a lot of examples to kind of get their mind thinking in these ways. But there are really great examples of like codified systems of ethics that people in college, like everyone in this class, the idea is we go to college typically because we're seeking training to enter more professional careers. I think personally, anybody could be professional at what they do regardless of what they do. But the sort of standard story is that we go to college to become more professional or to learn more about professionalism and what that involves. Well, professionalism typically involves some code of ethics that everybody has to accept, whether they want to or not. It's like even if they don't accept them, they know they have to obey them if they want to stay in the profession. there's extreme helpfulness to this. An example would be this National Society of Practicing Engineers, their code of ethics. It'll be included in the voluntary stuff for this week, but there's also codes of ethics for nurses, for social workers, for human resource people, for teachers, educators, any medical field, any technical field. There's going to be a code of ethics somewhere floating around. It just so happens the code of ethics for engineers I'm familiar with, but also it's so tidy. It's a really good example of how some professions lay these things out in a very tidy way, and they're pretty easy to see and understand. That an example would be like this code of ethics for engineers, and it tells you engineering is an important learned profession. But immediately you get these notions, these fundamental canons. Canon is the same as normalized. It's a norm. Things that become canonized, like sometimes we hear that in religious discussions, like the canon of, the Catholic canons or whatever. But what that means is just the norms, the standards for behavior that anybody who really wants to participate and play the game, game in a metaphorical sense, but if you want to play certain professions, you want to be involved in them, there are certain norms of behavior, how we are to interact with each other. And this is supposed to minimize harm. And the idea is the fundamental canons, like 1 through 6, is things like hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Well, for an engineer that's building bridges, cell phones, our heating and cooling systems, our planes, our cars, our space shuttles, yeah, that kind of makes sense. The way to think about these is, wouldn't we want our engineers to kind of hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public? Like us? Wouldn't we prefer that, like, say, Samsung, a while back, the batteries, their new battery technology, some of the batteries would catch on fire and burn up. They burned up some cars, a house or two got burned up, some people got burns on their arms and legs. Well, that could have been totally accidental. Very likely was. But the idea is an oversight. Accidents happen. We don't live in a perfect world. But the thing is we still want Samsung and all the engineers working for it to hold paramount our safety, health, and welfare. We don't, think about it. Would you really want, an engineering firm to be designing phone batteries that are like highly radioactive, that are going to give everybody a huge dose of radiation poisoning and all of the odd cancers and deformities that come from that? Wouldn't you rather them hold your safety, health, and welfare a little higher in regard than this new battery? It's like, that's why. That's what code of ethics do, though, is they list out, these are values: public safety, health, welfare. Perform services only in areas of their competence. Namely, you don't want a bridge engineer necessarily over there developing your new cell phone battery. There's tons of engineers, mechanical, electrical, civil service, civil engineers. Those are the people that make cities possible. They design the sewage, the water routing and systems that do all that. And there's environmental engineers, there's mining engineers. And the idea is, if someone is an expert at bridge building, they may not have the competence or the knowledge. Competence doesn't have to be, stupid versus smart. It can be familiarity with. Like a bridge engineer, an engineer that specializes in bridge design, may be awesome at building bridges. But that may not mean that means but that also follows they may not be that great at designing cell phone batteries, and they probably shouldn't apply to work for Samsung's cell phone battery development department. They certainly wouldn't want to lie about their credentials. And there's also things like act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees, and avoid deceptive acts. Lying, misleading people. See, those are values that have been sucked up into and concretized, turned into norms, and they can be referred to as fundamental canons. And you see there's more explanation of each of these, like one, hold paramount the safety and welfare of the public. Well, what does that mean in particular cases? Well, it gives you A, B, C, D. Same with each of these. And then it gives these obligations. Like I said, ethics tends to be about what are my obligations to other people. Obligations to keep them safe, not injure their health, not endanger their welfare. You see, those are professional obligations. Any professional field you enter into is going to have these kind of codes of ethics. And what is awesome about these is that they allow us to resolve conflicts, ethical value conflicts, in a sort of speedy way. It's like an example would be, let's just pick one of these. Like right here, engineers shall act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. Well, and then what does that mean in a particular case? Well, engineers shall disclose all known or potential conflicts of interest that could influence or appear to influence their judgment or the quality of their services. Okay, so let's pick on Bob again. Say that Bob's an engineer. He's working for I don't know, let's just use Samsung's battery development department. And Bob's working for their battery development department, while at the same time moonlights over here for some other technology firm's battery development department. And neither of those, Samsung doesn't know about the other, firm, nor does that other firm know about Samsung. And the idea is that Bob might be getting paid a little more by Samsung, so he lowers the quality of what he's doing for the other firm on a particular project. If Bob does that, he didn't disclose the potential conflicts of interest, and they influence the quality of the services he was rendering, we can look at what Bob did, look at that situation, suck right into number A or number 4, sub A, and say, yep, we can pretty much reach a pretty quick decision. Was that ethical or unethical for Bob to do? Bob acted unethically by that line there. But now realize there's a lot more going on here, and we need to spot check. We would need to make sure that Bob can't get off the hook due to some of these other things that are here. But we have a pretty immediate indication that 4A, that's extremely relevant to thinking about the Bob situation. In real life, everyday life that's not inside a professional field, we often don't have these nice tidy lists. But we do in most professions, and the reason for that is ethical conflicts, value conflicts. They show up, people do things, they make decisions, and the profession as a whole tends to buy in and accept these tenets. If one wants to be a practicing engineer in the United States, at least, they have to have a familiarity with this code. They have to accept it. They have to recognize that even if they don't agree with everything in here, all these numbers and sub-letters, that if they're going to practice, they have to obey. So you see, that's part of ethics too. Codes of ethics is they imply obedience. Accept, maybe. Obey, definitely, if you want to be a member of that professional organization. It doesn't really matter what we personally want. Once these code of ethics are solidified, we have to go along with them if we want to stay in that profession and continue to be a professional in that kind of way. That's just the way our society works. And there's values there, though. There's a good thing there because it helps us resolve these problems. Notice we're able to hop right here to 4A and immediately kind of start getting some insight into what how the valuation is going to play out. The decision about should Bob continue to be a licensed practicing engineer or not. We can start making practical, immediate, concrete decisions because of the very fact that this code of ethics exists, and because of the fact that if someone wants to be in this profession, they have to obey this code even if they agree with it or not. So, codes of ethics, listing codes of ethics, whether it's the code for engineers or it's a code for nurses or it's a code for social workers, human resources, teachers, educators, doesn't matter. They're all very helpful because they do the pre-work for us. We already have a list. And if that list is well laid out and tidy, we can immediately look through it and see if any of those norms apply to the particular situation. And then we can ask the question, did this person's decision or action, pass this norm, or did it fail this norm? You see, we have a metric. Once again, it's a standard we can make judgments and evaluations about. And it's not a matter of being like right or wrong as a person with these codes of ethics. It's more like one either met the standard or they didn't. And if they didn't meet it, it's classified as unethical. If they did, it's ethical. See, that's nice. That streamlines things. Now, there's a larger question about codes of ethics and have professions pick the right ethics. Are they, is avoiding deceptive acts a good norm to have for engineering? Well, it seems to be. But might it not be such a good norm for like lawyering, where lawyering, you make arguments. It seems like the truth may not be as important as winning the argument for your client. So if you're in a lawyering, like say criminal defense or civil, it doesn't matter. You'll have a set of norms, like the ethics committee for the bar association. And the idea is there will be norms. But those norms may not be the same as some other profession, because professions, the way they do their service or their job varies. But either way, if there's a list and it's a good list, like it's been well thought out and crafted over many, many years of the profession, it can be so very helpful. We can home in, interpret, and get to work. It doesn't mean that now, does this mean that just because, like, one might wonder, can ethical problems still arise within professions that have tidy and well thought out codes and lists of shared values or norms? Yes, absolutely. There will be cases. I just kind of crafted like a cherry picked case with Bob working for two companies and not doing as good a work for one as the other because I was sitting there reading the norm. And so I crafted a case on the fly that immediately applies kind of to that norm. But sometimes, think about how complicated real life is and the many experiences and situations humans, just us, get into on a day-to-day basis. We can't predict every encounter we're going to have. So that means that those lists, we can do our best to generate codes of ethics lists. But that certainly doesn't mean that everything we could encounter is going to appear on the list. Some of it could land right in between two principles or norms. Some of it could just land where it doesn't even seem like it hits the list at all, but we still have some intuition that, yeah, something was a little off here. This wasn't quite right. And that it may not violate the letter of the list or the law, but the spirit of it seems in some way impinged. That's when you really, the engineering or law or legal ethical committees, medical ethical committees, that's when they have to do some work. They have to maybe add some norms to the list, maybe become more clear about what they truly value and expect of members of their profession. So yes, absolutely. Problems, difficulties, disagreements, ethical value conflicts, they absolutely arise even in professions with well thought out lists and codes. But those lists and codes are a lot of helpful pre-work. We have a lot more to guide us through to decision making. Now, contrast that with the everyday. Like the things we see on the news, or on, people can look at various YouTube channels, whatever news outlet they want. And on any given day in this particular country, we will see a lot of people that seem to be disagreeing about things that are potentially harmful, that could be harmful. Also, there's tons of disagreement about how people should or shouldn't be behaving. There's tons of agreement and disagreement about what we need to prioritize the most in terms of core values. That's every day in this country. And the hard reality of that is that those things occur and they're so battle-like. They're so overwhelming because there doesn't seem to be a single bounded list or code that all the participants in these disagreements buy into. I mean, it's like we could home in and ask individual participants in some of these disagreements, okay, what list or code are you trying to follow? And they may give us a gesture at it, but they normally do not have a real hard line set of canon that we all agree on and all accept, or that we must accept. Like being a member of like the United States, our society and sub-societies within, the larger U.S. society, we don't all buy into the same code. And that creates tremendous conflict at times with battles and the warriors of all these things. And it matters. I mean, if nothing else, we have to encounter it on the news, and it can become a little taxing, tiring, where you're like, wow, is the world really this bad? And people have those thoughts at times. And this is typically a result of there's no code, like that nice little tidy code of ethics for engineers. There's a free-for-all quality to it. And it gets even worse when groups don't really seem to want to be listening or entertain any possibilities besides the tagline that they keep shouting or chanting, or the sort of standard boilerplate line that a politician might give. Those things make it very difficult to reach resolutions. I mean, extremely difficult. Like we've just seen how nice and tidy it could be if we have a code. Well, the real world, what we live in, what we see on the news every day, it's not as tidy. And so now, given that this is a class of ethical value conflicts, the idea is a class like this one should help us not only navigate these nice, tidy code-like scenarios, but it should also give us something to hold on to with these battles, these free-for-alls, these socio-political, religious, whatevers, ethical disagreements, ethical value conflict disagreements. So how are we going to do that? Well, philosophy, the philosophical approach to ethics, it can help. And it can do that for the tamer, code-based, as well as these wilder, real-life free-for-alls. How so? Well, philosophy is no different than all the other academic professional fields. That what do we do? Just thinking about it non-philosophically, what do we do when we're faced with a really challenging or complex problem? What is the human sort of thing? Typically, we try to develop a process, some stepwise way of approaching it and working through it to resolve the problem. If it's a huge, big problem, we typically, humans, develop a process, some like 1, 2, 3, 4 thing of how to work our way into it. Fortunately, we just start what's known as an inquiry. Inquiry may be a kind of weird word. People may not be totally familiar with it, but it's not magical, mysterious. Inquiry is just simply an investigation. It's a search. It's an exploration, but it's one that's conducted systematically in a stepwise fashion. And the purpose of all inquiries, in inquiry, we inquire into a problem in order to try to make sense of it and to make progress resolving it. That's why we inquire. And It's just a concerted effort to learn about some phenomena or to develop something or a plan of action. We inquire in order to productively do those things. If we're confronted with a big problem, we look at it and we create stepwise sort of ways to work into it to make sense of it so that then we can offer suggestions or overcome the difficulties. And it's fair to say that the hallmark of every inquiry that humans ever do starts from a place of, I don't know. It starts from a place of ignorance where there's something about the problem. It's so big or it's so complicated. It may seem simple, but as soon as we start thinking about it, it kind of just overwhelmingly expands. We're like, whoa, I just don't know where to even begin. It's like, what do I do? So it starts from this place of ignorance about it. And that's not a negative thing. It's just pointing to a lack of knowledge. Like we just don't know what to do initially. But the idea is we inquire because we surely want to know what to do. We want to resolve it. We want to do something about it. And fortunately for us, we're not the first people. So humans before us have encountered the same thing. Big problems, a lack of knowledge about what to do about them. They did some thinking, some reasoning, some experimenting. They developed stepwise processes for us. An example would be like the process of building a house. That's a big problem. Like think about it, just you or me as individuals that are not like, home designers or whatever. Maybe some folks in this class will be. Maybe they already are and they're going back to school. But they should realize this even better than most, that building a house is not a one-off thing. It's not a simple problem. I mean, in problem, keep in mind, we're not talking about problem like in a negative sense. What we really mean is some complicated situation that we need to figure out some systematic way to get through, to overcome, to manage. That's all we mean by problem. A problem could sound simple, but it could turn into something complicated really quickly. But so we use the notion of problem just for any complicated scenario that has a lot of moving parts, that has a lot of things that we could get distracted by. And we need something to focus our efforts, something to rein us in and not have our eyes dancing all over the place or our mind bouncing like ping pong ball, where we can't focus. That's what inquiries are about. That's what processes are about. We start with like, whoa, I'm overwhelmed. Then we go to a process that helps us home in on what might we need to do first to manage this mess. Is another way to think of a problem. So building a house, that's a big deal. There's a lot involved in that. And so this is just from a simple, step-by-step guide to home building process. This is not going to have all the steps involved by no means. In fact, the very first step, like prepare construction site and pour foundation, that's a good idea for a person that's thinking about getting a home built. You've got to have the land for it. You've got to have that land graded, smoothed out. You've got to have the concrete or whatever foundation poured, or if it's rock, placed. You've got to do that. That's definitely at the front end of the building a house process. But even before that, which this step-by-step guide doesn't seem to note, is if you're in a city or in a residential area, in the suburbia, you've got to have permits. You've got to have permits. You've got to have all kinds of things. You first have to buy the land or you have to lease the land. You have to do something. And so there's steps even before this process, even before this particular numeric representation of the process. This was probably offered by a company that offers they're like a home building management firm. It's a group of people and I think that's exactly where this came from. I mean, I got it, put it in here, but it's been quite a few weeks. This is probably from a firm that's going to do a lot of that work for you. And so all you really need to know is the order in which things are going to happen. Like you get a foundation, you put the rough framing up, you get the plumbing, the electrical, the HVAC, on and on and on until the final walkthrough with the builder. But humans develop these kind of stepwise things so that we have a sense of, yeah, this is a big complicated thing, but we kind of know what we might need to do first, second, third, fourth. Seems helpful. Another example of a process that many people in this class may be familiar with, many may not. But the idea of the general scientific method, this is like the sort of gold standard in many cases. That scientific method, it has done a lot of work for us, but it gives guidance. Like, how does one approach a problem of like a natural or physical phenomena, like something we've never really looked at, like a virus? For example, a virus is mutated, or something where a medical scientist, research scientist, or somebody in the population, they stumble across this new little bug, this new little life form thing. And it's like, well, how do we approach it? Well, scientific method's one way. We can say, well, what, how, or why is that? That tends to be the question, the problem. Like, what is this thing? I've said, it's a virus or something, but we may not know that initially. Well, we know that it's biological, but what more can we find out? What is it? How is it? Why is it? We generate these questions. Then we do data collection, observation. All of that goes into this. Then it's like, well, a hypothesis is formed. Like, maybe it's because of this. Maybe it's that. That's a hypothesis. I mean, it's going to be, I don't mean to make it sound, overly simplistic, because it's not. There's a lot of effort and time that has to go into framing the problem, the question, getting that stated very carefully. A lot of data is collected. A whole lot of effort has to go in to each of these little steps. In the hypothesis formation, there's better and worse ways to craft those. And then predictions can be made. Well, if it is because of this X, or if that's what it is, then why should it happen? Some results should happen if I do this. Like if I poke it with a stick, it should yelp. If it's like a sensile animal, like pretty much any little sensible mammal animal, if you poke it, it's going to squeal. And you can predict that. Say, I expect to squeal after I poke, I mean, once again, I'm simplifying it using kind of little, Dinkadoo examples here. But that gives you a sense of the steps. You got to kind of work the problem, the question you're trying to address out. Then you create a hypothesis that is a proposed answer to that question. It's a possible answer. Then you make predictions that would validate or invalidate or add support to or take support away from your hypothesis. That's what your predictions do. Then you experiment. You actually go poke the things with the sticks. You do this. You introduce these variables. You test on and on and on. You develop tests. And then you do an analysis, like, hey, after my experiments, did it actually support my predictions, or is there a correlation? Is there not? You may do a lot of statistical analysis, getting the standard deviation, all that kind of stuff. And then if it works out that you do think you found support, you share it. Like, hey, look what I found. Scientists may release it on their websites. They may put it in professional journals. They may just discuss it with other people at other research institutions. And then that goes under peer review. The idea is then other scientists, because in this process of laying out your experiments, you have to describe your methods, the machines you used, how you actually tested it, how you worked with your variables. You have to list all that out so then other scientists can go and check behind you. Or they can do the experiment again. That's the hallmark of the scientific method, is whatever you do within it should be repeatable by other people. That's a pretty useful process. That's how to start out with looking at a little biological thing that we don't know anything about. And actually, I mean, think about how big of a problem that is, especially if we have some indication that it may be bad for human health. I mean, that's a severe, severe problem. But then this kind of method gives us a way to walk into it and do it in a stepwise fashion to make progress, hopefully in a good way. There's also many students in here may be wanting to enter nursing later. There's the nursing process, the ADPI, where you assess, diagnose, plan, implement evaluation, and people can read through this. That this is a really super truncated version of this. There is much involved in it, but that's the typical big 5 steps to it. You can look at these footnotes. They show you the website, the American Nurses Association. You can look through all that. Engineering design process. This is definitely oversimplified, but I've given you a footnote to the book that I pulled these, 7 words from. And this process varies somewhat across fields in engineering, but this tends to be the big layout. But there's many, many sub-steps, just like you saw with the Code of Ethics of Engineering. There's lots. But the more detail is added in this process, the more guidance it is in addressing whatever the problem happens to be. Now, every one of these examples, they indicate that every single inquiry or investigation that we put time and effort in, it has a purpose. And what do these things actually do? Why do we do these things? This is the line that it's inherently contradictory, the statement, but it does carry a whole lot of useful in it. Is that what do these things do? I mean, why do we deal with these? Because we have a big problem. We don't know what to do, or we have a lack of knowledge. It's a big thing. We need it to be kind of, chopped up into little bitty bits so we can work on them. And then we work on each of those individual bits rather than seeing the problem and immediately just throwing potential solutions at it. We work through a stepwise pattern. Well, what does that mean happens to us? We're forced to slow down. We're forced to decompose a big problem into a bunch of smaller sub-problems. And then we have to systematically work through each and every one of them. That is slow going. Typically, it's a lot slower than if we could just hand a one-off solution. But the reality is most problems can't be solved in a one-off manner, and so we need to slow down in order to go fast. The agony involved in following each and every one of these little things actually takes less time than if we just throw aimlessly potential things we think might be a resolution at a problem. It's like we don't, if we don't really understand what's going on and we just try to throw solutions at it, normally that just wastes time. So the fast way would be like these one-off things. So here's a simple problem. Say I'm tired of sitting down, so I stand up. Problem, solution, simple. Versus, I need to design a new battery because our recent batch of batteries caught on fire and burned some people's houses down. And we pretty much don't know how to even really get started about that. That's where something like this helps. Or the key, though, is that what these processes do in inquiry, it forces us to go slow initially so we end up going faster overall. And we're productive. We're not just wasting time. We slow down in order to go fast. They give us these focused, systematic, reliably repeatable patterns. They give us the guidance of how to go forward. And if we do our best, we'll to try to follow them. I mean, we don't have to be blind, adherence to 1, 2, 3, 4. In fact, as we'll see in just a second, typically that's not the way these processes work anyway. But they always give us something to hold on to. They guide us. They force us to slow down so that we can make real meaningful progress on something that we could not have made meaningful progress on just by throwing whatever tends to come in our head at it and hope for the best. And everyone can read this. I'm not going to read through all the stuff. But the essence of it is we inquire in order to solve problems in a systematic way that we otherwise would not be able to do. We would waste so much time and effort trying to do. We have to pause, think, reason, learn, and understand. And that seems counter to a lot of human, our innate desire is we see a problem, we want a resolution right then, instant gratification. But real world stuff doesn't work that way. You may get lucky, but typically no. And so that's that drive, we have this innate human drive to go, to do, to be done. Like we're faced, like, here's a problem. We could be faced with an assignment in a course, like a course like this one. And we can approach it as, oh yeah, I just need words on the page. I just got to get it done. Is that going to produce better quality results, does one think, than if one approaches it systematically, like, okay, what exactly is the assignment asking for? What resources do I have to maybe think about this, address it? Okay, how exactly should I write this and think through this? One of those ways, the latter, is going to be slower, but the result tends to be of much higher quality. Whereas the go, do, get done on a class assignment, that may result in a terrible grade. And so going slower initially in order to go faster overall, that's what inquiry, that's what these stepwise processes are all about. And I presented them in this 1, 2, 3, 4 linear fashion, but the reality, as I foreshadowed, tends to be circular. It tends to be that we'll see a problem, we ask some questions, some answers, then those answers kick us back up to having to look again and reframe the problem, or either say we get some answers, we get some reasons, some evidence, some data. That raises more questions, so then we got to go through answers. And you see, these arrows are just, this is the minimal arrows. But this is the way inquiry processes tend to work. But notice the steps are always there. We just may have to go back, like that nursing process. I can promise you, creating a nursing diagnosis, one may be in the middle of doing that and realize they need to go back and do some more assessment. But we always have somewhere to go back to. And we know what the next step is going to be given any step we're actually at a given moment. So even though the real world is messier, it's much more, nasty and snarled up, even with our patterns of inquiry and how they play themselves out, having a kind of imperfect method or process of inquiry, a pattern of inquiry to follow, is better than having none at all. They give us guidance. They give us an idea of how do we get started. So, what pattern will we be using throughout the semester? Now, I've talked about inquiry and patterns of inquiry for a while now. People might be wondering, why did we start talking about this again? Well, keep in mind, what did we discuss? Typically, ethical conflicts arise in either a code-based system, like the Nursing Code of Ethics. We have some conflict we need to resolve, some problem, or they occur in the real world free-for-alls where people aren't buying into the same list and codes of norms and, ethical tenets and principles or values. There's a whole lot of disagreement. That's the problems we have to deal with this semester. So we need a pattern of inquiry to help us manage that. And hopefully everyone in this class will come to appreciate this little pattern. Is in philosophy, the way we approach complex issues is there's always a problem, some unknown. In this class, what should we do about abortion? That's a problem. Like, what values are involved? What potential value conflicts can arise? How do we deal with that? We already know that there's divergent value disagreements out there about abortion. We know that. Everybody that's ever watched the news or gone to churches or social gatherings, we all know coming in that there's a whole lot of disagreement about most any topic we could come up with, like abortion, charity, euthanasia, the way parenting is conducted. We know there's problems. So the pattern of inquiry, philosophical inquiry, always starts, there's problems. We identify, we try to think through the problems, try to identify them. Then we ask questions. Then answers are provided or proposed for those questions. Then reasons are offered in support of the answers. The arguments, which just happens to be answers paired with reasons. Like the end result of 3 and 4 generates what academics and professionals and philosophy people tend to refer to as arguments. We collect them all together. We make every effort to understand what we've collected. Then once we have a charitable understanding, we start testing, analyzing those arguments for like validity, soundness, cogency. We'll talk all about that stuff more next week. But then post-evaluation, maybe we can make a decision. Maybe we have reached a resolution of the problem. Or at least maybe we've made tremendous progress. We know more at the end of this process than we did at the beginning. We're more prepared to handle these kind of problems and think systematically about them at the end of doing this than we were to begin with. And then if all went well, we share it. Or even if it went badly, sometimes sharing a failure is not necessarily a bad thing. We can learn from failure. In many cases, we often do. And in this, I've spelled it out, kind of giving everyone more of an idea. So typically, how's this going to go for us? Each week, you'll be given there'll be assigned readings. There may be some video content besides, a little weekly video by me. You'll have that every week for sure. But there'll be other stuff from your textbook, articles. There could be videos, YouTube videos. There'll be many things that they'll all have arguments in them. It'll all be dealing with value conflicts or some ethical dilemma, some scenario. And what you can do is you'll always be able to approach it and apply this sort of 10-step process to that. And this is the way what we will practice all semester. It's just like if you were to take a beginning science class and you practice parts of the scientific method throughout the whole semester. That is what this class will be, we will be practicing parts of this. We typically won't be practicing all 10 of these parts at one time during one weekly discussion, but you can always use these parts to guide you of how to read this article. How do I figure out what the problem the author of this article is talking about? What is the core question? Like their moral, ethical question that the passage or the article, what is the core question? Like, is it about abortion? Is it about death? Is it about what? And you can know to ask that kind of question, to be looking for those things as soon as you start reading the article. This is the guide that we follow all semester to help us navigate even into the really messy, complicated things we see on the news. You can apply these things to it and make sense of what's going on, or realize that you can realize why it's such a near unsolvable problem. This will help you identify why. This process is just something that I have developed and other philosophy people have developed. They use versions of this. This is just the way I happen to spell it out. But it is a sort of philosophic method of how to walk into someone else's disagreement or conflict. Or it could be an agreement. You can understand how people are agreeing too. It doesn't have to be, antagonistic. It can be people trying to help one another. These steps are what we will practice. I'm not going to go through and read all of them in this video. This video is already quite lengthy. But this is what we will be doing and practicing over and over again all semester. So read through it, think about it. Next week, we'll be expanding more on it. And by using this to help us make sense of these difficult ethical scenarios, we'll actually be doing philosophy. Doing these 10 steps, this is what philosophy people do. Not all of them, but most of them. Regardless of the topic, whether it's ethics, it's metaphysics, it doesn't matter. This is the sort of mode of operation, the modus operandi. This is what it means to be doing stuff by means of argumentation. And that'll become clearer and clearer after next week. That being said, yes, next week you'll have a video by me that talks about this pattern and the role that argumentation plays in philosophical and ethical inquiries. A lot more detail coming next week. We'll run through some scenarios. We'll do some practice. In terms of, just so given this is the first week, how are weekly quiz questions? How are weekly quizzes designed? Weekly quizzes will always be about material inside these videos and these little handouts that go along with them, as well as quiz questions can be asked about the reading. They can be asked about any of the videos. Anything that appears inside a weekly module is fair game as a quiz or a test question. But the idea is that you have a weekly quiz each week. It will always be on material that occurs inside that weekly module. So if we're doing week 1, the quiz that appears inside this week 1 module will be about material in this video. As well as this week, the quiz will include some about like the course policies, the assignments, like one needs to have read through that course information sheet and the instructional package, the syllabus course schedule, if that's what you'd rather think of it as. And there'll be a few questions about that, or there could be on the quizzes. So pretty much anything that's associated with a week, that's fair game for quiz questions. And after you take this week's, next week's, they become pretty straightforward, where you know kind of the sorts of questions that'll be asked. Weekly discussions, they're opportunities to gain firsthand experience with and practice parts of the above mentioned pattern of inquiry. People will see that during this week's discussion. And everyone should be able to kind of gain a sense of how this week's discussion, I've been giving everyone the insight needed to be able to think through this week's discussion. But if there's any questions about this, definitely let me know. Just send me an email or post it to the just send me an email, and I will be glad, always glad. I'll do my best to help answer your questions. I am here to help. But until next time.